Great. Thank you for the introductions. That'll save us a couple of minutes
Yep.
explaining who we are. And thank you for the acknowledgement of the traditional owners around Australia. Chelsea and I come from representing, I guess, Kings Park today, which is on Whadjuk land, and I'd like to pay our respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and respects to elders past and present. So today is an opportunity for us to share a little bit of the lived journey that Kings Park's gone through in terms of the shot hole borer response. And we'll bring aspects from both science, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, but also the on-ground reality of the situation and the partnerships and the communication that's gone on to date in terms of facilitating the response, not just here in Kings Park, but for the Perth area more broadly. So when you say we've lived and breathed it, I'm going to hand over to Chelsea, who is the head curator of Arboriculture here, who has actually lived and breathed this probably 24/7 for the last few years. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about it too. And then I'll chime in a bit later with some science.
Awesome. Jump through this one. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I guess just to set the scene for those people out there who might not be familiar with BGPA. So we essentially create well-recognised botanic gardens and parks and aim to inspire the conservation of biological diversity. So we're a statutory authority. We sit underneath the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. So we're a state government agency. And we are the only botanic garden in the entire Western third, so Western Australia of the country. And so while we're located on Whadjuk land, we are also very fortunate to be the custodians and to care for plants from country right across Western Australia. The main two areas that we manage are Bold Park and Kings Park. So for people who aren't familiar with Perth, there's a nice little aerial map there. And those two big green remnant parts of vegetation that you can see are Bold Park to the west near the coast, and then Kings Park, which is dead in the centre of our CBD. So we manage over 800 hectares across the two sites. And at Kings Park, we also have the West Australian Botanic Garden, which is about 17 hectares. It's a big botanic garden with no gates. So that's what we deal with. We're also the centre of a lot of cultural heritage and environmental sites, some of state significance. And one of the areas that has been heavily impacted by PSHB is also extremely significant for Whadjuk people. And there are many songlines that run right throughout the state that originate on some of the sites that we care for. We're also WA's most visited tourism destination with over 5 million visitors a year. And we are bigger than Central Park in New York, making us the world's biggest inner city park. So we do a lot of things and we're a very, very visible location. This is a bit of a map if you're heading over the freeway from South Perth to North Perth to the CBD. Most people, as they're looking west, will see Kings Park. So on this map, you can see the red areas were some of the first removals of canopy that we had to undertake through the PSHB management program. And then those middle blocks of blue were also removed earlier this year to facilitate ongoing management and a large scarp restoration project that has been born from the PSHB response. This means that we have a lot of passers every day, and people driving into the city on their way to work can see everything we're doing. This is another aerial. The red outlined areas are canopy that has been removed in the last 3 years to manage PSHB and is now one of the biggest restoration sites that we've dealt with. However, is continuing on from 30 years of restoration works in that area to remove woody weeds and stabilise the scarp. So for BGPA, it's nothing new for us to deal with biosecurity. We are a botanic garden. We manage remnant bushland and amenity parklands. And so we've had that as a priority for some time. Interestingly, there's a number of programs that we have been participating in for a long time, which actually set us up really well to respond to PSHB. One of those was through Plant Health Australia, the Sentinel Network through Botanic Gardens. I can remember the notice coming through from DPIRD that PSHB had been detected, and Amanda Shade and I, who had been doing the inspections for a long time, thought, shit, this is going to be a big one. And around the same time, I can also remember having conversations with a number of land managers in Perth who said, nah, don't worry about it. It's probably just going to blow over. And here we are. So just, you know, a little bit of validation early in the piece. However, it really does highlight the good informed position that a lot of that work had put us in. So we were prepared when we have these biosecurity incursions. So one of the things we need to do, we need to protect the collection of the Western Australian Botanic Garden, and that was a very strong focus for us. We are covered by an Act of Parliament, and through the functions of our Act, we have really, really clear direction that our job is to preserve and enhance biodiversity. And that meant that we had a very clear vision that we could recenter ourselves on as we were moving through this. We obviously have to manage amenity values and tree risk through this process, consider the impact on natural systems, and we're very well set up as a networked state government agency to deal with our colleagues from different departments. So most people out there probably have heard of PSHB. I'm not going to labour too heavily on the biology. However, it is an ambrosia beetle from Southeast Asia. It does have a fungal associate, and in other incursions around the world, that fusarium is Fusarium uolacea. What we found in Western Australia is that it is an undescribed, unnamed type of fusarium, so AF18, and that probably explains some of the differences we're seeing in Western Australia compared to some of the other international incursions. The haplodiploid sex determination essentially means that these little guys are the perfect invaders, and a single unmated female can go off, clone herself, and start a new colony. They have really amazing biology. They're very, very good at rapidly increasing their population. And that means that it's really, really difficult to manage them in natural areas because a single beetle can go off and make her own colony. They can fly, they disperse in hot weather. Again, DPIRD told us early on that they were a bit lazy. And from now seeing these guys in the field a lot, they certainly are not, and they're very good at their jobs. We know that internationally there's over 400 reproductive host species, and a reproductive host is a host that can, has the conditions where the fusarium can then propagate. These guys are fungus farmers, so there's plenty of food for them to reproduce within the tree. And then we have a range of disease that is caused by that. In extreme cases, for things like Ace Negundos, PSHB can kill hosts within 2 years. For us, it was first detected in Perth in August 2021. There's a nice little map here. And in 2021, we were fortunate that there were a number of other international incursions which came before us, Southern California in 2003, and South Africa in 2017, which had very, very similar climates to the southwest of WA, and a range of experts who had done incredible work and were very, very generous with their time and knowledge. So when we reached out to them at the beginning of the incursion, we had this incredible peer support network globally. On our site, we've got a timeline here. So the first detection was in some of the southern suburbs of Perth, down near Fremantle, in August 2021. Kings Park was one of the first sites within Perth where PSHB was detected shortly after in November 2021. And that wasn't necessarily because it was our site, it was because we started looking. We now know, looking at some aerial data, some street view data, and interrogating some of the information that DPIRD has, this was likely in Western Australia a number of years before detection. From 2021, we undertook a range of treatments on our sites, so stem removals, trialling insecticides, and a number of small-scale removals. And we really led up to January 2024, where we had the first large-scale removals on the Mount Eliza Scarp. So the previous slide, all of those red and blue areas, is where trees began to be removed to respond to this pest. Since then, we've continued with some large areas of removals. However, those difficult decisions that we've made have put us in a really good position where we are able to now protect a number of our significant heritage figs, showpiece trees, which were really early plantings in the history of the Botanic Garden, and are of really significant cultural significance, been able to protect our collection and also our native bushland. So I've just pulled this from the PSHB host list. There are explanatory notes and a full list of susceptible species online. However, we know that this is only the beginning. For PSHB, it's a novel incursion into Western Australia, and it's encountering for the first time a number of species that globally it's never encountered. Up here, we've got the extremely susceptible exotic host species. Most people who work in arboriculture aren't that sad about this list, especially Robinia. A lot of arborists out there who are pretty chuffed about that. However, when we start to look at some of those highly susceptible West Australian species, they are things that are extremely significant parts of our urban landscapes and are very, very significant keystone species within our natural systems. So what are the symptoms? What are people on the East Coast looking for? And how have we seen this manifest in Western Australia? So the shot holes are really tiny. They're about 1 mil in diameter, about the size of a pen head. We're looking for branch dieback or death, which is caused by the fusarium fungus. We can have lesions and stains around holes. And then depending on the species of plant that PSHB is infesting, we can have resin drops, frass or noodles, a lot cuter than they sound. For things like avocados, we're finding that there's white powder or sugar volcanoes around the entry points. And the most distinctive thing is the black staining galleries caused by the fusarium. But we know that as PSHB moves through the landscape, a lot of these external symptoms will vary due to the host. For surveillance, some of the things to consider is that when it rains, a lot of those symptoms, the frass, the sugar volcanoes, are washed away. That can also happen when we have overhead irrigation, which is common in a lot of our parks. For deciduous trees, they hide canopy decline really well, and you might find that things simply do not come out of dormancy. Poor tree health also can cause a range of dieback symptoms, which makes surveillance very difficult. But one of the things that we have found is that stem failures that arise from windstorms often are a really great surveillance tool, as skilled staff can then inspect the butts of failures and look for that really telltale black staining in the galleries. Be really wary that we have a range of native species that present the same way. One situation I had was a concerned arborist on our site called me, went up in the EWP, and we had a whole load of 1 mil little holes in a huge tuit. And looking at it, there are a whole bunch of little faces looking back at me. And they were full of native bees. However, it shows that for people who aren't familiar with a range of our native species and how they look in the field, sometimes we can misdiagnose these symptoms. The lessons learned from surveillance, as I said, a novel infestation sometimes means that global host lists are only partially useful. Again, some of the information we had from California was that figs were not reproductive. And I can remember feeling really relieved about that. And 3 years later, we have a lot fewer figs on our site than we used to. So really being prepared that some of that global host list might not be relevant to Australian situations. There's a huge variation in how species present, and definitely microclimate plays a huge role. We have some species on our site where things in highly irrigated garden beds have been absolutely riddled, highly infested, things that we've removed, and simply across a pathway into our natural bushland systems where there's no irrigation, there's a low nutrient load, but the exact same species, we're finding that those individual plants are not being infested. So microclimate, high moisture, low wind, really lovely kind of Southeast Asian rainforest sort of environment in some of those gardens that we manage are making our plants more susceptible to PSHB. And then, of course, monitoring susceptible trees for declines However, we've got a range of other things there: nutrient disorders, pest and disease, drought or waterlogging. Again, in some of the amenity environments that we manage, especially in botanic gardens, in urban forest settings, these things are very common. So I'll just blast through a few photos of some symptoms. This is a Nason Agundo. It's at a site that thankfully we do not manage. However, you can see how the extent of holes and frass can appear in highly infested trees. These are the same trees at the same site in Perth, and we have very different sort of symptoms between an old tree on the left-hand side that had progressively declined and the infestation had not been detected, and a young tree on the right. This is a beautiful example of a London plane tree. London plane trees are interesting. In Perth, we're finding that they are not declining the way they did in South Africa. However, in stressed environments, they are very appealing to PSHB. These are things that some of the other the local government associations around Perth have really successfully been able to treat with intensive pruning and chemical application. However, you can see on the stems here the gumming that we're finding. However, this tree did end up completely dying and was removed. This is an example of a Moreton Bay fig at the Perth Zoo, and some of the latex exudation that you can see on these main stems. However, this is not necessarily symptomatic of what we see often on figs. This is one of our local endemic tree species, Amaria corymbia calophylla, and you can see the extent of the fusarium within that sapwood. That staining that is coming out of the galleries and then is shutting off the vascular system for this tree. We detected this tree because it had a very unusual pattern of dieback, however, was in one of our very wet sites. For marries, one of the challenges that we have for surveillance is that they do have these rough bark plates that generally are absolutely covered in bark beetle holes, which look very similar to PSHB. However, when you do scrape the bark back, you can see these two holes in the middle here, perfectly round. And then if you use a sharp, clean chisel to take away this bark material, you can see the fusarium staining in those oval shapes around the entry holes, which is very typical of PSHB. So treatment, what we found, and I won't go into treatment too much, surprise, surprise, fundamental integrated pest management is the best way to reduce pest load and to equip trees to be able to respond to infestations. So for us, since the beginning, what we've been doing is targeted pruning to Australian standard to remove heavily infested limbs. Contact insecticides, so things like bifenthrin or emamectin, has been really successful in preventing reinfestation of face cuts, where we've essentially opened the tree up to wounding, which is very appealing to these beetles. Improving tree health and vitality where we can, we found that has been a factor in susceptible species. And some of the treatment is being prepared to make difficult decisions regarding removals. It sucks. However, again, having that clear vision of protecting biodiversity and the WA Botanic Garden has meant that we've been able to communicate why we're doing the things we're doing. So lessons learned from treatment is really engaging with the lead agency. And for everyone on the East Coast, if PSHB does make it your way, I can't recommend enough to engage with whichever government agency is the lead agency and keep the pressure up. In these responses, natural systems, urban environments can be put on the back burner. And so use the goodwill that you have with these agencies to really advocate for your lands. Offer assistance and be a trial site. You can get a lot through by making it a trial, but it means that you can work with these departments instead of against them. As I said, have a clear vision, be really wary of commercial interests. There is a lot of promises being made around a lot of chemical solutions, some of which are not safe for complex ecological environments, especially near aquatic systems. There's a lot of regulation around these chemicals for a very good reason, and off-label use can lead to legal situations that you don't want to be in. And of course, one of the things being Botanic Gardens, we have a whole load of expert advice that we can use to advocate for best tree management. Biosecurity responses are often not experienced in dealing with complex natural systems. They're not very good at dealing with long-lived trees. So a lot of these responses are really set up for agricultural pests. And on a farm situation, you can pile up all of the tomatoes and burn them. However, when we're dealing with natural systems, when we're dealing with urban forests, the impacts of those expectations from the system mean that sometimes experts who can provide expertise in managing these things can really have a disproportionate impact on saving some of these systems. So this is an example of one of our deciduous trees. It was the first one that we actually had to remove for PSHB. It was an Erythrona, a coral coast tree, and this was one of the 2 remaining original trees planted at the Botanic Gardens in our Californian allied plants collection. You can see on the left here, this was this beautiful tree in full canopy. In June 2022, we noticed some dieback in the upper branches, and then by the next season, when it was coming out of dormancy, it simply didn't wake up. So usually by October, that tree should have been in full flower. So these things can move very quickly. And this is an example of how fast you can lose collection within some of these areas. This is another bit of a painful image. On the left-hand side, it doesn't look like a particularly big tree. This was one of our 100-year-old figs that was removed at Mounts Bay Gardens due to high pest load and the need to protect the Western Australian Botanic Garden, which is above this site. On the right-hand side is this tree after it's removed. And again, just for the scale of the loss of this tree, you might be able to notice that there is a very grumpy looking arborist with her hands on her hips just to right of that stump, and that's me. So this is what is at stake from PSHB. So what do we do as Botanic Gardens? What can we offer in these biosecurity responses? And really, there's a few things that were a bit of superpowers for us. So one, we practice collection management on a daily basis, and that's part of our core business. We trusted experts, and we're really passionate about plants. And everything we do is underpinned by science. One of the things in collection management is understanding that living landscapes are changing landscapes, and that's no exception for us. On the left-hand side here is a photo of the original Fraser Ave plantings, which were Corumbia ficifolias, red flowering gums, being removed. And they were removed in the late 1930s because they all had a bacterial canker and started to die. The trees that were replaced were lemon-scented gums and are the ones that now line Fraser Avenue, the iconic entry into the Western Australian Botanic Garden, which you see on the right. So it's an important reminder that living landscapes do change over time, and it doesn't need to be a panic. Living landscapes require active management. I keep saying all the time in things, trees are living things too. And one of the things that we ran up against some interesting conversations in this response is that for a lot of local governments, a lot of land managers, they treat their trees as furniture. However, as arborists, as tree experts, we've been in the position to advocate for them, to reframe urban forest gardens and amenity spaces as collections of living assets that also appreciate in value. And reminding people that management requires skilled and resourced practitioners within their agencies to be able to safeguard these collections. For us, we've done a lot of collection management and a lot of consideration over the last 3 years. And part of that is being able to really understand our collection and prioritise which trees are most significant. Some of the removals that we've undertaken have simply been because we cannot resource surveillance, management and treatment on every tree on our site. We have approximately 40,000 trees just within Kings Park. And when you're needing to put climbing arborists into trees to surveil for PSHB, it's simply not practicable. So we've started prioritising trees in regards to their age, their status, their conservation status, or their cultural value. So this tree on the left, if people aren't familiar with it, is Gidgejumulu. It's our 750-year-old boab, which was transported from the Kimberley down to Kings Park. So this sits at the top of the 60-metre scarp, which is directly above the area where we removed most of our figs. One of the things that really triggered the response to then undertake that treatment and remove those figs was that our trapping systems detected that PSHB were flying up the scarp and were hitting traps about 50 metres from this tree. We know from the South African response that boabs are susceptible species for PSHB. And so again, looking at some of these significant cultural and environmental specimens that we care for on a daily basis was a really useful way to kind of zero in that focus on what was significant and what we needed to do. Through this, we've retained some sentinel trees, which are from highly susceptible host species, which we regularly then do surveillance on. And that's something for the East Coast. I really recommend looking at your Aesynagundos and beginning to use them as sentinel trees throughout your cities or parks. For some of our trees, we've also started to remove things from the collection, which we know essentially don't have a future. For some of those, they're highly susceptible species where the value of the tree is simply not worth the management. And we have the opportunity to plant some new things, which is great. Essentially, out of all of this, we're wanting to develop succession plans to ensure that we're building diverse and resilient collections, not just for PSHB, but for all of the ecological threats that we know present challenges to managing our landscapes. For some of the lessons learned, again, trusted experts, we found that there is a huge appetite for information and authentic communication. I don't really like being in front of the camera. I've been in front of the camera more than I ever really wanted to be. However, I think it's really valuable for Botanic Gardens to really be in a position where they can upskill the community with informed but passionate information. We can connect industry as well. I'm an arborist, and so being able to connect through the arb industry has been fantastic. And really talking to people about plants is what we do best. It's where we feel most comfortable. And as I said, it's a bit of a superpower of Botanic Gardens that I don't think we should underestimate. Here in Perth, canopy issues have become a really hot button topic. There's a few little newspaper snippets on this slide here. For those on the East Coast, Perth has the lowest canopy coverage of any capital city in Western Australia. And we've noticed that our local community has really responded to that. And they're really interested in what we're doing. For some of the benefits of outreach and engagement, one of the things is it has allowed us to manage expectations. Again, to have genuine and direct conversation with our largest stakeholders around what our resources are, what we can and can't do, and why we're doing things has put us in a really good position where people are sad about tree losses. They understand why and the significance, however, are also engaging in our restoration efforts, which is fantastic. It means that we've also been able to be a proportionate and evidence-based voice and sometimes provide context to information that's coming out from other agencies where they are not as experienced or they don't have the latitude to have some of those longer form conversations. One of the things that we're really passionate about is being an advocate for non-agricultural ecological communities. One of the challenges of this result is, this infestation is that it is being managed under the emergency plant pest deed. And a lot of these systems, as I mentioned, are really set up for primary industry. That means that a lot of our urban forest or our wild ecological communities are left out of the picture, and we can then engage with stakeholders to have that conversation. And part of it is continuing to build and encourage a community of practice. So all of those stakeholders, every single one of the people who complains to us or writes in with an email is an opportunity to have a conversation about how critical canopy and plants are. So one of the lessons that we've learned for industry is really to encourage people to protect what they have with industry best practice arboricultural practice. So as I've said, PSHB isn't the only threatening process, and there are a range of standards that people really should be adhering to, but often aren't in the arb industry. One of the other things, as I said, that is a superpower for Botanic Gardens is that we practice plant science, and it underpins everything we do. So this has put us in a really good position to communicate about the threats of PSHB, understand how they're playing out in the field for our own collection, but then also move into the restoration space for areas where we've been impacted. So some of those restoration science, seed collection and banking. So we've got over 60,000 plants being planted over 3 years at our restoration site, and all of the seed has come from our own lands. They've come specifically from the scarp endemic species, and so we know that they're optimized to move into that area, and I've got a lovely little photo later on where you'll see how well they're doing. We're also experts in propagating endemic species and looking forward to future scenarios. One of the things that we really have been advocating is adopting a restoration mindset. Did you want to speak to this, Jason? No?
That's right, you keep going.
Okay, I just realised I'm on a roll.
You keep going.
So knowing that we have a number of crises facing us, and PSHB isn't the only one, climate change is a big one barreling towards us, is really communicating in everything we do about a restoration mindset. So never wasting a crisis, looking for opportunities to practice restoration and communicate the benefits. And of course, on the sites that we are managing, increasing biodiversity, improving the sense of place, and having better environmental outcomes. So essentially, we're looking for those better places for plants and people, again, bringing back to the core function of Botanic Gardens. Now I can switch to Jason.
Great, okay. I have a few slides just to, I guess, reflect on the science engagement with the response and some of our management actions to date. I think it's been particularly eye-opening when we go through a response, as we have to Shot Hole Borer, to see how the different agencies and different stakeholders kind of work together. It's important to note that when you're going through a response, the data is being collected at a phenomenal rate and in a very complex manner, but that data has to be managed very sensitively to best inform kind of responses. And because of that sensitivity around the data, there can be a level of frustration from the wider community to try and understand a little bit more about, the spread and the risk factors when it comes to, shot hole borer and some of the other factors driving the tree decline that was becoming a little bit more obvious to the public as we kind of went through the response. So from our perspective at Kings Park, we could see trees starting to decline, and we started asking questions around where's the science at and how can we get involved in the conversation. Just a quick step back, just to reflect on the Kings Park Science Program so people have some awareness of that. Like any botanic garden, our science program is there to support conservation management and sustainable development of our natural environment, and that we have a strong focus on the areas that Chelsea mentioned up front, that being Kings Park and Bold Park, to highly biodiverse systems right in the heart of Kings Park. So we bring together a whole range of different disciplines that you can see there to support agendas like ex situ conservation for our managed lands, but also more broadly for the state. But also we drive a state agenda around how can we better inform conservation decision making throughout the conservation estate and even across Western Australia and the world. And these disciplines that we've brought together work really well together for most part. When we have issues that we're dealing with off our estate, we have to work with a whole range of different partners to try and find the best solution. So here's just a number of people that we've been working with through the years. A lot of private sector, there's community groups, there's government agencies, and there's the tertiary sector as well. So that's just who supports kind of our agenda in terms of research into conservation issues. That I'll explain why that's important in a second. But I think what's really important to note is that we don't have all of the capability. There are so many issues that are coming across our desk that we haven't got the expertise to deal with. And one of those that's been highlighted recently through this response is, the absence of forest pathology, not just in our program, but I'm going to say for the state as a whole. We have had a shift away from some of these more core fundamental disciplines across Western Australia. I don't know how that's playing out across the rest of Australia, but I think it's really important to understand that refocus around the science agenda in the forest pathology space might be kind of required, not just for this response, but for other things that may be coming in the future. So although we didn't have this kind of expertise, I think the important thing was, and just drawing on a couple of the key institutions that we've been working with over many years, was that we were able to tap into some of this expertise directly through some of the universities here in Western Australia, but also indirectly because universities are well connected globally, and they know who's at the forefront of research in some of these issues that we haven't encountered before. So, and I'd like to particularly thank Professor Trina Burgess from Murdoch University, who has really led the research agenda for the state, and I've been working with Trina a little bit around how we can bring a focus to a science response for WA. I'd also like to acknowledge the work that Chelsea and the team have done with DPER, the Department of Prime Ministries and Regional Development. We have a strong scientific relationship with them, but I think over the response, what became evident was the willingness of Kings Park to work with the lead respondent in a proactive manner, being sympathetic to views and the response, but trying to find ways for collaboration. And I think that's put us in really good stead, having these two government agencies kind of working together. So the interesting thing was that, as I said, there was this shot hole borer was kind of taking shape. People could see trees declining, and there wasn't really a strong research agenda set from day one. So from a Kings Park perspective, I think we could see an obvious opportunity to try and bring stakeholders together. And it wasn't until February 2024 when we managed to do that. The stakeholders that were critical to kind of bring together were the people that were involved in the response, people that were managing the data and understood the systems pretty well. We also brought together key academic institutions, local tree managers as well, and the nursery industry. So we had people in the room all at the same time, which was great. It was the first time that had been achieved. Not just that, we brought in expertise from internationally as well. So Trudy Papp came into the room and reflected on global lessons learned, so we didn't have to reinvent wheels as we shifted through our response as well. The interesting thing about the timing of this workshop was the day before we had the workshop, there was some messaging that was put out by some academics around the response and being offering up other solutions, I could say, and being potentially slightly critical of the response to date. So this came literally the day before we were hosting the workshop, but we managed to bring all of those people as well as the respondents into the room to try and figure out what's this base level of conversation we can have and how can we build from it. So there were contentious issues being discussed, but it was great to see everyone kind of come together. And I think that's the role of Botanic Gardens, is we have these collaborations and we have this mindset of trying to bring the community together for the best outcome for conservation. So the way we stepped through that workshop, getting that international expertise was great. Seeing the lived experience that Chelsea and the team had worked through, so people could actually see what was happening on ground in terms of a response, what was required and kind of why. But also we brought in experts that had already been thinking about more of the modelling components around shot hole borer responses that came from a little bit more of that biosecurity and threatening processes understanding, and they'd already started bringing together some data sets. So we had this nice group of people that could come together. Kind of after that initial workshop, we landed on some key themes. There won't be anything too surprising here. It was complicated discussions, but we managed to land on focusing research agendas around understanding the host dynamics and vulnerabilities. We were seeing, as Chelsea said, species that had been impacted that we never thought would be impacted or had never been seen to be impacted before. We were dealing with a new fungus, and the beetle ecology was likely to be a little bit different in our system as well. So we knew that we had to bring some thinking together in that space. At the same time, new incursions were happening across the Swan Coastal Plain, trying to understand things like how can we better detect these incursions, how that might therefore inform control or containment. The containment areas were set and then expanded again as things kind of moved out. So we needed to try and keep at the forefront of the incursion. And that was all going to rely on some modelling as well. Some of that to inform how the incursion was playing out, but some of it was also going to be what the responses might need to look like for Western Australia and for any other incursions that might be playing out. Then kind of step through a couple of scenarios where we look for these potential quick wins, so things that in terms of a response or from a research agenda anyway, that might have high impact with low amounts of investment. And some of the things that obviously came to mind was there was an enormous amount of data that was being collected through the response. What does that data look like? People had very limited visibility over it, and potentially through collaborations, we could bring scientists in to more intensively examine that data. So we might be able to learn a lot more lessons. The other thing was, and this is where Trudy Papp was instrumental in the conversations, was what are all of the studies that have happened globally? What lessons have been learned? What's in the literature, but what's in the grey literature as well, and in people's heads like Trudy, they've got a lot of lessons that have been learned. How can we tap into that so we don't reinvent wheels, or what are some things we might be able to leverage off? That was really, really important to us. There's another couple of items there that we kind of discussed as well through this scenario. The other thing we kind of looked at was what research would result in high impact outcomes, but require a higher amount of investment, these potential game changers. And of course, where everyone went to immediately was what's the silver bullet control that we might be able to roll out? Are there chemicals, biological opportunities to get on top of the incursions? But there were some other more fundamental biological things that we needed to try and understand a little bit as well around what causes beetles to move around the landscape. If we could try and understand a little bit more of that ecology and those dispersal mechanisms, then potentially we could get on top of future incursions and understanding when they might move through the landscape as well. So these are all the conversations that we had. At the end of that initial conversation, the big outcome was that we had the stakeholders on similar pages. We'd identified some initial opportunities, and we explored the possibility of opening up the data in a controlled way for researchers to be able to interrogate, which was fantastic. Immediately following that, and there was discussions at the workshop, was the formation of this scientific advisory group, which had members from state government and some practitioners involved to help drive the scientific agenda that was going to be required, taking on board what we'd uncovered as part of our discussions. The next stage after the advisory group was formed was that DPIRD, they have a research institution or collaboration that sits within their organisation called the West Australian Agricultural Research Collaboration. And Dr. Kelly Pearce heads up that program, and it's been phenomenal in bringing the next stages of the research agenda together, which has been great. So WARC was tasked with bringing the research agenda together, but also identifying funding opportunities for what we had previously discussed. They stepped through a series of workshops and discussions as well. And what was really useful for us to see was the priority research themes that were being discussed were nothing new. They were the things that we'd already identified. So it was great to see how the agenda was being followed up. Being an agricultural research institute, you can see there in the purpose that there's a focus on minimising impacts to agriculture, and that has been driving the agenda. But clearly the incursion is sitting in our natural landscapes now, which enabled us to bring some of the attention and focus onto our natural systems to try and prevent the next kind of incursion into the agricultural space. And WARC have been very receptive to those conversations, which is great. A couple of themes, there's a few research topics that were discussed and have now been implemented. The first one is relating to the host pathogen pest environment. Clearly, we're dealing with new species, slightly different pathogens, and a different environment. So understanding how all of those things work together to influence infestations and host susceptibility is going to be critical to understand. Core understanding around the biology of the beetle and the ecology of the fungus is going to be at the forefront of the initial research that needs to happen. Of course, a lot of people are focused on control strategies. Although there's been a lot of lessons learned internationally about things that have trialled and failed or might not be suitable for use in Australia, there is a desire to continue to explore this integrated pest management approach, looking at chemical, biological and other approaches to support the strategy. So I think it's useful to explore these things while we continue to maintain the actions that we've seen being successfully applied here at Kings Park in tree and, where required, limb removal to keep on top of the beetles. And the third kind of theme is just improving that detection and surveillance. Clearly, a response is only as good as the data that you're bringing in. So being able to detect these incursions as soon as possible and keeping an eye on the broader landscape in terms of surveillance is going to be really important, and how you can build research agendas around risks and host and site occupancy is really important for us over here. I think one of the important things is it can't just be driven by researchers. Some of this stuff, the community will have a role to play. So exploring things like citizen science, getting community groups, local governments educated, aware of how you can detect what implementation might look like in terms of a surveillance program in a local government's mindset will be really important to think about. So taking that science into an end user platform will be really important in the short term. So we do have some focus on that. I think the good outcome of all of this is that we now have a research program that has been established here in Western Australia, supported by the West Australian Agreement, DPIRD's WARC program. So that's fantastic. At least we've got some research going, and it's strongly collaborative, focusing on decision support tools for managing shot hole borer. This has been led by Professor Ben Phillips out of Curtin University. Ben comes with a phenomenal understanding of biosecurity risks and incursions, and has developed predictive models for other systems in the past. So he's leading a consortium in terms of using those predictive models for risk mapping to help with the surveillance. In terms of increasing tools for control, Leo Evans from UWA is really leading that agenda, looking at those innovative chemical, biological control mechanisms that may have a role in the response, sitting alongside the more traditional approaches that we've seen. But he's also looking at identifying things like attractive chemical lures and focusing a little bit on that citizen science component as well. And finally, the third project that's kind of come to light is developing the integrated pest containment strategy for shot hole borer. And this is kind of a little bit more of where Kings Park sees a strong focus, and we are supporting this program, which has been led by Trina Burgess out of Murdoch University, and that's really focusing on the fungus and the hosts, and trying to understand what species are going to become susceptible, what is the Fusarium fungus actually doing here in Western Australia, and that will hopefully help to support control and containment in the future. In addition to that, there's this landscape scale detection program that's being considered at the moment. So how you can use remote sensing, risk mapping and geospatial analysis to help with the early detection system as trees start to decline across our landscape, and how we can link that to the shot hole borer incursion as opposed to every other stress that our trees are under in our urban environment as well. So that's just a little bit of a history of where we've got to, but I think more importantly, what I was trying to get across is there are a few lead researchers now through institutions that people can tap into, and the West Australian Ag Research Collaboration will be a portal for some of this research information that's coming out. And so I think keeping an eye on the information that's coming out, and we will continue to do our best to disseminate that information through the networks, will be important as we step through this control. 3 years worth of funding on the table now to really get a better understanding of the system before it moves too much further.
All right, so we might end at this slide. So where we are now is that we've just had a change in the federal response. So until now, we've had a 3-year funded eradication response. And then earlier this year, the National Management Group had determined that it was no longer feasible to eradicate PSHB from Western Australia. That means that we've moved into a funded 3-year transition to management phase. However, we don't actually know what that looks like yet. What that has meant for us on the ground is that from the 1st of July, with about 24 hours notice, we lost all of our case managers, all of our field surveillance, and at least 2.4 FTE staff members worth of labour on a weekly basis. We're no longer receiving lab support either, and we don't have a plan out of this. The interesting thing is that over the last 3 years, we've built an incredible network of people. We've done a lot of internal work, and we've expected that things were going to continue to change. So now we've built this incredible internal capacity. We have a clear vision, and we're in a good position to manage PSHB on our lands. What that will mean externally for your East Coast folks is that that's probably where the West Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development will move into a capability building phase. So we expect, we don't know, we hope, that will mean that there will be a lot more outreach and engagement in the other states. So they can then build that capability and network on the East Coast for people in case PSHB does jump the border. If that happens, we know how much that we've benefited from the incredible network globally and nationally and within Western Australia of people who are advocating for our plants, advocating for our natural systems and dealing with biosecurity. So I'll leave that there. We've got a few more slides that are in the deck. We can make sure that that's distributed and some resources, some fantastic public lectures and things that have been arranged over the last 3 years. But if things happen, you know how to find us. I'll be at the BGANS conference later this year, or we have our details. Always happy to jump on a call and chat through things or provide more info.
Thanks, Chelsea and Jason. That was extraordinary. There's so much information in there. Look, I think that point you've made about Kings Park playing a leadership role and working across industry and practice and science is, the very best of practice. So we will stay in the loop as well. Jason, you mentioned distributing some of those research outputs. Is there anything you've adopted internally, like a standard operating practice or a field note or a practice note that could be shared, for instance?
In terms of the response that we've done today?
Yeah. Just in terms of that, even within your own team, I don't want to give you another job.
For surveillance or treatment or?
Well, the full package, really. Yeah.
I think what I'm going to say is we do have a standard operating procedure, but it's in a few people's heads at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be, important for us to try and get some of that information captured and sent out. But that's going to be on us to continue to advocate and provide that information as best we can.
Yeah, and to this date, through the eradication response, essentially we have been provided with a set of guidelines. We were then issued tree management plans, and a lot of those were sort of working documents with DPIRD. However, moving into this next phase of the response, that's definitely something that will become more important, and we can then provide that guidance outwards as well.
We can potentially also do some advocacy around that capability and spreading that knowledge to the east as well. Look, we've got quite a few questions, which if everyone's happy to stay online. James, I'm going to send your beetle question direct to Chelsea and Jason. He's just interested in how many other bark and ambrosia beetles you've collected in the park, so I'll send that one direct. Janine, who's based here at the Australian National Botanic Gardens, is interested in whether you've come across any information about persistence of borer in cold climates you were talking about that global list. obviously you've got a very Mediterranean climate over there in Perth, although you've had a couple of years of very, you know, extreme heat and not much rain. So yeah, whereabouts would people find that information?
So there's, I will find it. I think there was essentially a literature review which was done by one of our colleagues within our department, which pulled together all of the international host list data. I would caution again that in Australia we are seeing differences in the host range. One thing in terms of cooler climates is that we know that essentially the optimum temperature for PSHB is 24 degrees, which I think is dead on Perth's average temperature. We really only start to see a mortality below zero and in quite high temperatures. Of course, if you're a beetle that lives in a tree, wood is a fantastic insulator. And so we're not going to see much mortality within Australian temperatures. We do see a significant decline in activity over our cooler, you know, Perth does have that wet, cool time. And in terms of a difference to the international response, we really only have one dispersal event a year. We're finding that's in about March, which coincides with our hottest, driest part of the year. Whereas in other areas, they did have 2 dispersal events in places like California. We can send out some of those international host lists and some of those fantastic resources that have been compiled by some of our colleagues, maybe in some notes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Kia, I'm going to send your query about tree removals at Hyde Park in WA to direct to Jason and Chelsea. Tom's asked, he says, apologies if I missed it, could you elaborate on why trees in wetter microclimates demonstrate higher susceptibility? One might expect that higher water would enhance resin gum latex production and therefore bolster defence mechanisms.
So the answer is everything we know is really anecdotal. They are beetles from Southeast Asia, and looking at their normal ecological niches, they are going to kind of seek out those preferred environments. Part of it is that we're finding that individual plants, so other species or the variation within species, that they're essentially looking for things that are really juicy. So we're looking for things with really active sapwood where that fusarium can propagate. Interestingly, and I never thought it would be the case with figs, you know, if you're dealing with a Moreton Bay fig, anyone who's cut into one before knows the level of latex they produce. These guys have some mechanism, and I don't know, I don't think it's been published, which can really short circuit that latex production. So we have active transpiring fig stems that otherwise appear to be healthy. And if you cut them, they will weep latex, and we don't have latex being plugging up those holes. So we found in marries, the keno veins in marries, if the tree is healthy, will plug holes. However, there's still a lot of research to be done around that mechanism of boring.
And I think that's one of the important factors in the research agenda moving forward with that host pathogen pest environment space, is that we have some understanding of tree temperatures and water status. We need to pull that data together along with the infestation rates to really get to the data sources of some of these observations that we have been making on our designated lands.
Yeah, it's real time what's happening. Yeah. Brad's asked about, you spoke about, and I loved you talking about your trees as living assets and, you know, advocating that narrative. And Brad's asked, you mentioned assigning different values to collections to help prioritise management of that living collection. What were some of the value categories? You did mention the cultural significance for the BOAB. Yeah.
So again, we don't have a written framework. We have a kind of a suite of documents, you know, strategic documents, tree management plans, things like that. Really, it was zoning things that are either in our highest public areas. So if people are familiar with Kings Park, we have areas like the State Botanic Garden, the State War Memorial, some of those really high occupancy amenity landscapes. We have areas where we have conservation collections within our Botanic Garden. So even something, the difference between a display, you know, it's a display collection and a conservation collection.
Yeah.
You know, the critically endangered collection is going to win. And then some of them were really looking at our most significant iconic trees. And so again, if you're a Moreton Bay fig on Fraser Avenue, you're 110 years old and are one of our showpieces, you're going to win out over a wildling Moreton Bay that's in the bushland, that our bushland manager was pretty stoked when we said we were going to do some collection management and begin to reduce that potential pest load or those natural reservoirs where we know we might not pick it up in time, and then it would put pressure on our bushland areas.
And how much, you spoke a bit about the public and the community. When you actually started to get stuck in and remove trees, you're very good in front of the camera, by the way, Chelsea. I'm sure you killed it. How did you manage that side in terms of, like, I suppose keeping them informed as well all the way through the process? It's so visible.
Yep. So again, the benefit of being a botanic garden is that we have an incredible range of volunteer groups and guides. They were really critical to bring into the conversation early, and again, have kind of honest conversations with them. And some of that was, we don't know how this is going to play out. We're going to do our best and we'll keep you informed. One of the other things that I'd recommend to anyone is having a really clear comms strategy from the beginning. And that was fantastic because it meant we had consistency of communication both internally in our agency, within state government, but then externally as well. And some of that was actually proactive comms. We did find early in the piece it was a challenge because at state government and ministerial levels, we had different opinions on and directions on who was able to speak to the response. But again, I think presenting that friendly, approachable face was really beneficial, and having a solid comms plan meant that we could do proactive comms. And for some of it was that making sure that we have a good working relationship with a lot of our journalists and local TV shows. Being transparent and saying, you know, we had a project website, tree removals will be happening. We had pre-signage, so there's no opportunity for a gotcha moment, because you really want to be on the front foot with that and fess up. And so when the news cameras roll, they don't get to catch anyone. You've already given them that copy. You've been transparent. You've brought them along on that journey, and then also given them a light at the end of the tunnel. So with these removals, we always talk about what we're going to do next. We're going to build more resilient landscapes. We're going to plant endemic things. We're going to keep trying, because that's what we do, instead of sort of just saying, trust us, we're the government.
Yeah, I mean, as the curators, you share the grief with the community about the loss of that you know, those trees.
Yeah, I that big stump, I thought I was a big brave arborist. I just dealt with all of the cranes are demobilised, all the chippers, and I thought I was really brave. And I've got to admit, I did have a bit of a cry on top of that huge stump. So it does, it people feel it. And I think one of the things is that for everyone out there, really engaging with the community, because there is genuine distress about what's happening in our urban areas, in our natural spaces, and people do feel that. And I think those spaces where we can make sure that the community feels heard and that they have someone in their corner, again, is a bit of a superpower of Botanic Gardens. And it's just another way that we can reach out to people. Maybe the first time they've only cared about the environment is because their Ace Negundo on their front verge is being cut down. That's great. We've now got that way of communicating with those people and kind of getting them into our gang.
So we'll add shot hole borer resistance to climate resilience and all those other things we have to think about with the urban tree estate and our botanic gardens. Look, Fiona Fraser said, thank you so much, you two, for your valuable insights and experience. As Chelsea said, you're going to be at Big Anne's. I'm not sure I want to ask Chloe's question. She says, do you have any other projections or insights of other possible invasive species like the shot hole borer that are currently jumping around internationally? I hope not.
Just don't talk about Xylella, right? That's the one that's like, I'm going to learn to drive a lawnmower, I think.
I think these conversations that you're pulling together are absolutely fantastic, because there's lessons learned here, which hopefully might put the eastern states in a better position moving forward. And we're learning a lot about the myrtle rust response coming the other way. So it's really critical for these conversations to happen, and that's why we just need to be open.
That point you raised about forest pathology is a really key one that's happened in the myrtle rust space as well, plus the gaps in the environmental biosecurity focus across all of those biosecurity agents, federal and state. So I think we should send you on a speaking tour. 6 months off for Chelsea. Off she goes.
I think on that, again, in terms of people to reach out for, I'm even looking at some of the tiles on this call, and there's a number of people from LGAs in Western Australia that have dialed in, people who now are also experts in this response and looking after things in their own patch. So there's a lot of people who have been very generous with their time in Western Australia. And yeah, as Jason said, if we can pay forward some of the learnings we've had from the myrtle rust response, that's put us in a really good position. So there's a bright future. It's not all doom and gloom.
Well, thank you both, and thanks for staying online. You've kept, half of the audience online, so there's a lot of interest. It's a really critical issue, and all we can say is thank you for your generosity in sharing